James Carter had always found solace in his driveway vegetable garden. After losing his job in the economic downturn, he relied on it not only as a source of fresh food but also as a modest source of income, selling surplus vegetables at the local farmers market. It was a lifeline, a patch of earth that stood between him and hunger. But to the Pinecrest Homeowners Association, particularly its iron-fisted president, Mrs. Martha Reynolds, the garden was an abomination. It didn't fit the aesthetic standards of the community, a term she wielded like a weapon to maintain her grip over the neighborhood. The first warning letter came in the mail, stuffed with condescending language about property values and neighborhood harmony. James shrugged it off. After all, he had seen plenty of violations throughout Pinecrest: unapproved lawn ornaments, fences taller than regulations allowed, and even Mrs. Reynolds' own elaborate, unpermitted fountain, which gurgled obnoxiously in her front yard. Surely, this was nothing more than a misunderstanding. But when the warnings turned into fines, and then daily harassment, James realized that this wasn't just about vegetables. It was about power, control, and something much darker lurking beneath the surface of Pinecrest. James had never intended to defy the HOA, but he had little choice. His savings were dwindling, and every tomato, every bell pepper, every leafy green was a necessity, not a luxury. While other homeowners in the community spent their weekends hiring landscapers to manicure their lawns, James spent his mornings tending to his crops, learning the delicate balance of soil pH, sunlight, and water conservation. Yet, despite his efforts to be self-sufficient, the HOA viewed him as nothing more than a nuisance, an eyesore that needed to be erased. What frustrated him most was the blatant hypocrisy. Mrs. Reynolds and her allies selectively enforced the rules, issuing citations for minor infractions while ignoring the blatant violations of their own board members. The pristine white pergola in Mr. Davidson's backyard, clearly against HOA regulations, remained untouched. The oversized American flag mounted on Mrs. Calloway's porch, despite the HOA's strict guidelines on flag displays, was never questioned. But James' modest garden, a necessity rather than a decorative choice, was the sole target of their wrath. It was clear, the rules weren't about maintaining community standards, they were about maintaining control. Desperation led James to research. If the HOA was going to come after him with legal jargon and bylaws, he needed to arm himself with knowledge. Late into the night, he pored over county regulations, state laws, and legal precedents regarding homeowners' rights. That's when he found it, Section 479, a local ordinance passed during a drought emergency years ago, explicitly allowing homeowners to cultivate food-producing gardens, even in areas governed by HOAs. The law was clear: food security trumped aesthetic concerns. James read the section over and over, feeling a newfound sense of hope ignite in his chest. If the HOA was in violation of county law, then everything they had done, the warnings, the fines, the harassment, was completely unenforceable. He printed copies, highlighting the key sections, and prepared to fight back. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. This wasn't just about his garden anymore. It was about standing up against a system that had long gone unchecked. The moment James shared his findings with a few close neighbors, the response was immediate and overwhelming. He wasn't the only one frustrated by the HOA's overreach. The Johnsons, an elderly couple who had been fined for leaving their trash cans out for too long, were eager to stand with him. The young single mother on the corner, whose son had been scolded by Mrs. Reynolds for playing too loudly in his own yard, was ready to fight. Within a week, the Pinecrest Freedom Coalition was born, a collective of homeowners fed up with the HOA's selective enforcement and intimidation tactics. Meetings were held in James' backyard, where neighbors swapped stories of unfair treatment and discussed strategies to push back. They gathered evidence, photographs of HOA members violating their own rules, documented instances of harassment, and, most importantly, the legal loophole that rendered much of the HOA's enforcement void. It was no longer just James against the HOA. It was the community against a corrupt system that had long operated unchecked. The fight quickly turned ugly. When Mrs. Reynolds caught wind of the growing resistance, the HOA doubled down. The fines against James skyrocketed overnight, reaching absurd amounts. Notices of impending legal action appeared in his mailbox almost daily. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. One morning, James stepped outside to tend to his crops and was met with devastation. His entire garden, once lush and thriving, was reduced to a withered, yellowing wasteland. The smell of chemicals lingered in the air, unmistakable to anyone who had worked with plants before. Someone, the HOA, had poisoned his garden with a commercial-grade weed killer, wiping out months of labor in a single act of calculated malice. It wasn't just an attack on him, it was a message to the entire community. This is what happens when you defy us. The sight of his destroyed garden sent a wave of grief and rage through James, but it also solidified his resolve. They had underestimated him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Just when James thought the HOA's attacks couldn't get any worse, the unthinkable happened. He received an eviction notice. At first, he thought it was a mistake. He owned his home outright, having inherited it from his late parents. But as he read the fine print, the true horror of the situation unfolded. The notice wasn't from the HOA directly. It was from Pinecrest Holdings LLC, an obscure shell company that had quietly acquired his mortgage lien through a legal loophole buried in HOA bylaws. James' stomach churned. He had never heard of this company before, but a little research revealed its shocking origins. The HOA itself had connections to the company, using it to target homeowners who resisted their authority, driving them out and flipping their properties for profit. He wasn't just dealing with petty neighborhood politics anymore. He was standing in the way of a carefully orchestrated scheme to force people out, rezone the area, and transform Pinecrest into an exclusive luxury development. Mrs. Reynolds and her cronies weren't just power-hungry busybodies. They were profiteers, using the HOA as a weapon to line their own pockets. Furious but undeterred, James called an emergency meeting of the Pinecrest Freedom Coalition. The community gathered in his backyard, their faces grim but determined. They had all lost something to the HOA's corruption: money, freedom, peace of mind, but the destruction of James' garden and his impending eviction made it clear that no one was safe. Together, they devised a plan. First, they gathered undeniable evidence: photographs, video recordings, financial records, and testimony from current and former residents. Then, they compiled a dossier of selective enforcement, proving that the HOA had let their own members violate rules while targeting others. But the most damning piece of evidence was the paper trail linking the HOA board to Pinecrest Holdings LLC. They found public records showing that Mrs. Reynolds and 2 other board members had financial ties to the company, directly profiting from the evictions. This wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal. With everything in place, they prepared to take their fight to the highest level. Knowing that legal battles could drag on for months or even years, the coalition decided on a different approach: public exposure. If they could turn the town and the media against the HOA, they could dismantle it faster than any courtroom ever could. Channel 7 News, a well-respected local station, agreed to cover the story, interviewing James and his neighbors while exposing the corruption at the heart of Pinecrest's HOA. The footage of James' poisoned garden, coupled with stories from evicted homeowners, ignited a firestorm of outrage. Social media exploded with calls for the HOA board to step down. But the real showdown came at the next public HOA meeting, where James and the coalition arrived in force. With news cameras rolling, they confronted Mrs. Reynolds, presenting the evidence piece by piece. The crowd erupted in anger as the truth unfolded. Pinecrest wasn't being beautified for the sake of property values. It was being gutted for corporate greed and personal gain. The once feared HOA president, now visibly shaken, found herself cornered by the very people she had tried to control. The fallout was immediate. Mrs. Reynolds resigned in disgrace, her aspirations of running for city council in shambles. The town's mayor, seeing an opportunity to earn public favor, ordered an immediate audit of Pinecrest Holdings LLC, which revealed a decade's worth of fraudulent transactions and illegal land acquisitions. Lawsuits followed, and within weeks, the HOA board was suspended indefinitely pending further investigations. The rezoning proposal that had threatened to turn Pinecrest into a corporate playground was officially scrapped, restoring the neighborhood's residential protections. But beyond the legal victories, something even more powerful happened. The people of Pinecrest realized their strength. The HOA had ruled through fear and deception, but once the truth was exposed, their power collapsed like a house of cards. With the HOA dismantled, the community wasted no time reclaiming their neighborhood. Instead of another oppressive board taking its place, they formed a resident-led neighborhood association, focused on support rather than punishment. The rigid, arbitrary rules that had once stifled Pinecrest were replaced with a spirit of collaboration and mutual respect. James' driveway garden, now a symbol of resistance, was replanted with the help of his neighbors, its vibrant greens and reds standing as a defiant testament to their hard-won victory. And in a final poetic gesture, James delivered a basket of fresh vegetables to Mrs. Reynolds' doorstep as she packed up to leave town, a quiet but unmistakable reminder that she had lost. But this wasn't just his victory, it belonged to every resident who had stood up against corruption. Pinecrest wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a community. With the oppressive grip of the HOA gone, Pinecrest underwent a transformation. No longer forced to abide by arbitrary restrictions, homeowners embraced their newfound freedom. Gardens began popping up in front yards, backyards, and even in once empty lots. What had started as James' quiet act of defiance had now become a full-fledged movement. 37 new gardens sprouted across the neighborhood, each one a symbol of resistance and renewal. The Pinecrest Freedom Coalition, once just a band of frustrated homeowners, evolved into a true community organization, advocating for sustainability, local food production, and fair governance. Instead of relying on overpriced HOA-mandated landscapers, neighbors helped each other plant fruit trees, build raised garden beds, and install rainwater collection systems. What had once been a sterile, cookie-cutter subdivision was now alive with color, diversity, and collaboration. Children played freely in yards without fear of noise complaints, and neighbors, once strangers, now shared meals made from each other's homegrown produce. Pinecrest had been reborn, not through corporate development, but through the people who had fought to take it. What had begun as a means of survival for James soon became an economic boon for the entire neighborhood. With so many gardens thriving, homeowners began selling their excess produce at local farmers markets, creating a small but powerful economic ecosystem. James, once struggling to make ends meet, now found himself at the center of a local food movement. He expanded his garden, built a small greenhouse, and started offering workshops on urban farming and sustainable living. Other neighbors followed suit, growing specialty crops, herbs, and even beekeeping to produce honey. The local market, once dominated by imported grocery store produce, now had a steady supply of fresh, locally grown food. But beyond the financial benefits, the gardens provided something far more valuable: food security and independence. No longer were homeowners at the mercy of rising grocery prices. They had control over their own food sources, empowering them in ways they never imagined. Pinecrest had gone from an HOA-controlled suburb to a self-sustaining community, proving that true wealth wasn't in property values but in shared resources and resilience. James' battle with the HOA had not only changed his life but had also turned him into an unexpected leader. Once a man struggling with unemployment and uncertainty, he had now become a respected voice in the community. His deep dive into local laws and ordinances gave him a newfound appreciation for legal advocacy, and he began working with other neighborhoods facing similar HOA overreach. He helped residents in nearby communities challenge unfair fines, expose corrupt board members, and push for homeowner-friendly policies. His story, covered extensively by Channel 7 News, inspired countless others to question the power structures in their own neighborhoods. Soon, James was invited to speak at city council meetings and community forums, advocating for legislation that protected homeowners from abusive HOAs. What had once been a personal struggle had become a citywide movement. James had never seen himself as a leader, but life had thrust him into that role, and he embraced it fully. What happened in Pinecrest didn't stay in Pinecrest. The media coverage of the HOA corruption scandal led to increased scrutiny on HOAs across the state. Investigations were launched into other communities where similar schemes had been uncovered, cases where board members had secretly profited from shady property deals, imposed unjust fines, and manipulated zoning laws for their own gain. In response to public outcry, state legislators proposed a new homeowners protection bill, designed to limit the power of HOAs, prevent fraudulent property acquisitions, and require transparency in all HOA operations. James, now seen as a key figure in the movement, was invited to testify before the state Senate, sharing his experience and the lessons learned from the Pinecrest battle. What had started as a war over a vegetable garden had now become a statewide push for homeowner rights. And as the bill gained momentum, other communities across the country began paying attention, eager to reclaim their own neighborhoods from oppressive HOA rule. Years later, as James sat on his porch, watching his garden flourish once more, he reflected on how much had changed. The home that had once been a target for eviction was now a beacon of community resilience. His driveway garden, once condemned as an eyesore, was now a landmark in Pinecrest, a symbol of resistance and renewal. The neighborhood was stronger than ever, no longer ruled by fear but by cooperation and mutual respect. And though Mrs. Reynolds had long since left town, the basket of homegrown vegetables James had given her remained a defining moment, a final, silent victory. Pinecrest had won. But more than that, James had won. He had gone from a man struggling against an unjust system to a leader who had helped dismantle it. And as he bit into a fresh tomato, still warm from the sun, he knew that his fight hadn't just changed his own life, it had changed everything. The changes in Pinecrest didn't just remain within its borders. The success of the community's rebellion against the HOA became a blueprint for other neighborhoods across the country. Inspired by James' story, homeowners in other HOA-governed communities began banding together, exposing corruption, challenging unjust fines, and demanding legal protections. The Pinecrest model, as some called it, became a term used by grassroots organizers who sought to reclaim their neighborhoods from oppressive oversight. James started receiving emails and phone calls from people in different states, Arizona, Texas, Florida, who were dealing with similar problems. Many had seen his interviews on Channel 7 News and read articles about Pinecrest's victory. In response, James launched an online resource hub, offering legal templates, guides on how to gather evidence, and advice on organizing against HOA corruption. What had once been a personal battle had now become a full-fledged homeowners' rights movement, one that would ripple through the nation for years to see. While Pinecrest had managed to dismantle its corrupt HOA, James knew that without real legal reform, other communities would continue to suffer under similar oppressive organizations. With the backing of community leaders, local politicians, and even some former HOA board members who had turned whistleblowers, James helped draft a homeowners' Bill of Rights. The proposed legislation aimed to limit the power of HOAs, require financial transparency, and ensure that no homeowner could be fined or evicted without due process. When the bill was introduced to the state legislature, it faced fierce opposition from powerful real estate developers and HOA lobbying groups, but public support was overwhelming. Thousands of homeowners sent letters, attended hearings, and shared their own horror stories of HOA abuse. The bill passed with a landslide majority, setting a new legal precedent for the protection of homeowners. James had not only freed Pinecrest, he had changed the with the HOA officially disbanded, Pinecrest had the freedom to redefine itself. The Pinecrest Freedom Coalition evolved into a permanent neighborhood council, but unlike the HOA, it had no power to impose fines or dictate personal property decisions. Instead, it focused on community improvement projects, sustainability initiatives, and local food programs. One of its first major projects was turning a neglected, vacant lot into a thriving community garden. Residents who had once been at odds now worked together, growing food that was shared among neighbors, donated to local food banks, and even used in school programs to teach children about agriculture and sustainability. The transformation of Pinecrest was so remarkable that it caught the attention of state and national organizations focused on urban farming and food security. James' once-banned driveway garden had inspired an entire neighborhood to embrace self-sufficiency. Even after the legal battles had ended, James' story continued to gain traction. Major news outlets picked up on the Pinecrest victory, with national newspapers and online platforms publishing in-depth features about how a single man's fight against injustice had led to sweeping change. James was invited to appear on television talk shows, podcasts, and even academic panels discussing the future of HOA governance and community-led resistance movements. Documentarians approached him, wanting to turn Pinecrest's story into a feature-length film. While James never sought fame, he recognized the power of sharing the story. If more people understood their rights and how to fight back, fewer would fall victim to the same corruption. The more the media spread the story, the harder it became for corrupt HOAs to operate in secrecy. Looking back, James could hardly believe how much had changed since that first HOA warning letter about his garden. What had started as an act of necessity, growing food to survive, had evolved into a battle for justice, a fight for his home, and ultimately, a movement that reached far beyond Pinecrest. He had gone from a struggling man, barely making ends meet, to a leader who had reshaped his neighborhood and influenced laws. The community that once felt cold and controlled had turned into a place of unity and cooperation. The very people who once feared HOA retaliation now celebrated their freedom, their gardens, and their ability to make their own choices. Sitting on his porch, watching children run past with baskets of fresh vegetables and neighbors chatting about the upcoming farmers market, James knew he had won, not just against the HOA, but against the idea that people must always bow to systems designed to control them. Pinecrest was living proof that a single act of defiance could spark a revolution.